Now we come to our real subject tonight, or one of them, and we hurtle ahead as if in an old time tunnel movie. On September 11th, the editors at the magazine were faced not only with the horror that had struck us all in our own city, we were faced with the question of what to do about it. The newspapers and the news weeklies, the television networks and the wire services had their own clear, defined roles to play, and I think after many, many long seasons of trivia and neglect, they took on an incident of great seriousness and complexity and performed, some of them, with great courage, energy, and intelligence. The networks, incidentally, have long since returned to a more trivial tone, but there was that moment where they too seemed up to the challenge. The New Yorker's role in this was less defined. Our history, our recipe, as I say, evolved greatly over the years as the New Yorker developed and Harold Ross and his successor, William Shawn, matured with the magazine itself. Writers of great depth arrived on the scene. It's been said that for Americans, the only parallel to the attack of September 11th in terms of shock and military invasion or attack was Pearl Harbor. And that week, more than 6 years ago, in the frenzy of things, I asked to see the bound volumes of the magazine for December 1941, the month of Pearl Harbor. I wanted to know what Ross and Shawn had done about that terrible incident, what the covers were like, what the drawings were like, what the articles were like, how writers and artists were deployed. I wanted to see if there was any editorial guidance from these two great predecessors. And what I discovered was that the New Yorker was no more prepared editorially or psychologically for Pearl Harbor than the U.S. Navy or anyone else had been. In that first issue after the Japanese attack, Talk of the Town began its article this way. And it's maybe hard to translate the kind of unbelievably casual and whimsical tone of this. It begins like this: war came to us with the football in Brooklyn's possession on the Giants' 45-yard line. Japanese bombs have fallen on Hawaii and the Philippines, a hurried announcer's voice broke in to say. Keep tuned to this station for further details. We now return you to the Polo Grounds, a great stadium in New York at the time. No more than that. That was it. That was the tone in which World War II, the Second World War, began in the New Yorker. The distance between New York and Pearl Harbor was, of course, greater than it is today. Communications were primitive by our standards. Our connection infinitely more distant. There was no internet, no television, barely any radio from Pearl Harbor. There was a telegraph connection. The rest of the magazine, that first week of the war, featured a profile of Thomas Mann in Hollywood, cartoons, a light love story, someone's memoir of a provincial childhood, and a review of the Christmas gifts on sale along 5th and Madison Avenues. In the ensuing weeks, there was a little bit more in Talk of the Town, some but not much. If the New Yorker had been an army, it would have been slaughtered in its barracks. It was that slow to the front. And yet, in the months and years to come, the New Yorker, like the country itself, woke up to the war. It proved equal to the war, and in a profound sense, grew up. The magazine matured. The magazine did not try to imitate any other publication. It employed its particular strengths, namely the individual talents of people like Janet Flanner or A.J. Liebling, Edmund Wilson in his way, and John Hersey, and in the process compiled a coverage of the war that was unique, vivid, and even, in some regards, lasting. It is a coverage that included Liebling landing with the troops on D-Day, Philip Hamburger walking the streets of Rome the day that Mussolini was hanged from a lamppost, and it ended with Hersey's deceptively simple account of the nuclear attack on Hiroshima, a work that took up an entire issue of the magazine. The transformative experience of the war certainly included the transformation of New Yorker reporting. That's not to say that all of it was dark or even political. What I mean is that the New Yorker took on a certain ambition, a depth, an awareness of distant places and foreign people that it had not had before, not to that degree. And undoubtedly, something had changed. Following the example of Liebling and Mitchell and Wilson and Flanner came the generations of Calvin Trillin, Jane Kramer, who for years wrote Letter from Europe, John McPhee, Janet Malcolm, Mark Singer, and now Philip Gurevich, Seymour Hersh, George Packer, Larissa McFarker, and many others. And so by the time September 11th came, we had behind us that experience of the war in Vietnam as well. In that first week, Art Spiegelman, within 2 days, was able to devise what I think was a classic cover of Memorial, the so-called black cover of the Twin Towers as shadows of memory. And reporters like Adam Gopnik and Anthony Lane were able to report, and Michael Spector, quickly and with a certain literary grace. In an internet age, the New Yorker's place is not to distort itself with speed, but to go in deep, to go in quickly when we can, but always with a premium on depth, analysis, intelligence, and even moral searching and critical reporting. In the past 6 years, and I expect for many years to come, we have at the same time relied on a sense of the magazine's DNA and a confident notion that the New Yorker evolves as it must, and we who write and edit it are absolutely free to do so. We are financially supported by a hands-off ownership that never asks in advance what we publish and never really reacts to what we publish the previous week, which is a gift, I can tell you, as a journalist that, as we say, keeps on giving. Although there were no cartoons in the magazine that first week of 9/11, I couldn't personally bear the thought of choosing talking dog cartoons that week. Humor reasserted itself eventually, and as a result, I'm proud to say that the magazine has, for the past 6 years, featured what I think is some enormous achievements of individual reporting, including most famously Seymour Hersh's reporting on Abu Ghraib, as well as John Lee Anderson and George Packer from Iraq and other distant places that have become our great obsessions. I'd also like to talk this evening regarding the press about change. What has changed? What is not? What should change? And what will? Some years ago, if I can make another reference to my own magazine's great writer, A.J. Liebling, Liebling said that freedom of the press is limited to the man who owns a press. This is something that has some resonance here in Italy, I would think, as well. This is no longer precisely true, though. To some extent, freedom of the press is yours for the price of a laptop or an hour at an internet cafe. The rise of the internet is potentially the greatest boon to the transmission of human thought and communication since the 15th century, and the most transformative passage in the history of the press, potentially. The internet, first conceived as a means of scientific and military back and forth, has revolutionized our access to the best, as well as to the most mediocre and ugliest of what has been thought, written, and said by other human beings. It allows for unprecedented exchange across borders. It allows for unprecedented speed. It allows me to get up in the morning and read newspapers from New York to Jerusalem, to Sydney, to Beijing. And one hopes, incidentally, that Beijing will soon get an equal chance at equal access to the internet. It allows average citizens to participate in the witness of and conversation about historical events as they happen. The catalog of the internet's benefits, potential and existing, is practically endless. And while the business pages are filled with the news of my own business's anxieties about the so-called internet challenge, there is no doubt that the net is the sort of instrument, unlike military power, say, that has the power and ability to inform and persuade, to hold out the attraction of free speech to those who are denied it, and to help sustain democracies for those lucky enough to live in one. In any case, it is an instrument that can help in limitless ways to challenge power where it is corrupt and create dialogue where there once had been none. The internet, of course, has added immeasurably to the capacity to retrieve information, the capacity to search information, to fling information and opinion all over the globe in an instant. The internet has even sparked something called citizen journalism, which reached its high watermark, if you'll forgive the pun, in a situation like New Orleans, when the local newspapers, for the most part, flooded out, and citizens were able to send photographs and information, who was alive, who was in hospital, to various sites, including the New Orleans Times-Picayune website. This is the same is true with foreign reporting. Some of the best foreign reporting we've gotten from Iraq shows up where? It shows up on blogs. Perhaps unchecked, perhaps requiring even more reporting, but certainly a certain kind of raw, sometimes opinionated, sometimes direct journalism has shown up from many of the dangerous spots of the world. Rangoon is another instance of where this has happened in an exciting way. There's also lots of chatter, lots of nonsense, lots of sarcasm, lots of self-referencing and commentary and so on. Some of it informed, some of it nasty, some of it depressing for what it reveals of the universal conversation. But the internet, per se, is as value neutral as the printing press itself. It is and will be what we make of it. And all that is wonderful. Surely the powers of the internet are in their embryo stage, waiting to be hatched by the most imaginative among us, or I hope so. But as I think most internet professionals acknowledge, as a means of transmission, it is not the press itself, no matter how large or how rich. Remember, Google may win a lot of advertisers, God bless them, but it has no reporters. Bloggers are a mixed bag, so are professional reporters too, I acknowledge that. But there are standards of proof, and there are editors in this world, and we need to retain and deepen those skills. As my colleague at the New York Times, Bill Keller, has said, if you are ever inclined to trust Google as your main source of news, Google yourself. This is a bracing experience. Beyond the internet as a fantastic tool with unlimited potential, what concerns me most is less the means of transmission than the overall health of what is being transmitted, particularly the state of journalism, and today in particular, investigative journalism. What all journalists must confront, no matter if their medium is the New York Times, the New Yorker, or a nascent blog, is that governments lie. Public life is filled with men and women of virtue and self-sacrifice, people often of the best intentions, not all, but many. Yet it is also a matter of historical record that governments lie. They spin, they shade, they cover up, and sometimes they deliberately mislead the public in ways that have historical consequences. The danger of such deception is obvious and enormous. A government that deceives its citizens invariably goes on to deceive itself, and in doing so, risks everything. As the great reporter and American self-publisher I.F. Stone once put it, all governments lie, but disaster lies in wait for countries whose officials smoke the same hashish they give out. Take the current mendacity, the government's case for and the conduct of the war in Iraq. According to every account I've read, and there have been tons of books now published in English and in every language, concurrent with the war because it's lasted so long and the reporting eventually is so good. The Bush administration was firmly and absolutely committed to go to war against Iraq well before the public debate in this country and abroad grew to its height. Practically within moments of the news of 9/11, the president, for his own reasons, even familial Oedipal reasons, sought to link al-Qaeda to Saddam, and the march to Baghdad was on. When one aide thought to present the president with at least some contrary evidence and arguments, Condoleezza Rice told him, "Save your breath." But no matter how firm the administration's resolve may have been, it remains a great failure of the press, a failure of all of us, meaning the press in this room, not to have discovered the truth about Saddam Hussein's arsenal leading up to the war. Whatever its varied motives, the Bush administration put the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction issue, at the very center of its rationale for war. And the press did almost nothing to shake it. Several factors made that story extremely difficult to get, it's true. There's no doubt historically that Iraq had such weapons and used them in its war with Iran and against its own people in 1987 in the Kurdish north. Further, the West's major intelligence agencies agreed that the policy of containment and inspections had not succeeded in putting an end to Saddam's stated WMD ambitions. Perhaps most bewilderingly, as a long article in the journal Foreign Affairs called Saddam's Delusions, published last year, makes plain, the nature of the Iraqi regime was so secretive and so perverse that Saddam himself actively propagated doubt about the state of the Iraqi military, a system of deception and self-deception that fooled or gave pause to everyone in the Iraqi ruling elite and the intelligence agencies that tried to monitor them. Before the start of the war, there were doubters, serious doubters, protesters, and some publications reflecting that doubt. But the placement of those stories was generally obscure, and their resonance, the degree to which they were followed up and developed, too slight. What gained far greater play were the stories leaked, generated, and even cooked up by the administration and groups like Ahmad Chalabi's Iraqi National Congress. What gained credence in the Oval Office was a particular narrative and articles of faith that had been encouraged from on high. This White House, more than any other, was one that discouraged and even actively stamped out contrary argument and evidence, whether it was about the state of the Iraqi arsenal or the number of troops that would be needed to win both the war and the subsequent peace in Iraq. Dissenters like General Shinseki, who argued that 400,000, not 150,000 troops were needed to provide security in post-war Iraq, were banished. Now, like many others who were not neoconservatives, not even conservatives, and like some leaders in Europe, like Havel and Remnick, I was one who, despite grave misgivings about this administration and a desire to see greater efforts at arms inspections and the construction of an international coalition, too easily conflated the relative success of intervention in the Balkans and the tragedy of a lack of intervention in Rwanda with the situation in Iraq. That was a foolish mistake. But as I say, this war was coming. The president and vice president, the defense secretary, and his Pentagon were hell-bent, and no contrary argument would leak out to the press or through their well-constructed screen of reality. According to Philippe Sand's book, Lawless World, President Bush told Tony Blair in the White House in January 2003 that while the United States would put its, quote, full weight behind a second UN resolution before invading Iraq, war was inevitable and had already been penciled in for March 10, like a date. Acknowledging that no WMDs had yet been found, Bush raised three possible ways of provoking war if the U.S. case failed in the United Nations: flying a U-2 spy plane painted in UN colors to draw fire from Iraq, producing an Iraqi defector to testify about the presence of WMD, and assassinating Saddam. To add clueless to mendacity, Bush also said, according to David Manning, Blair's aide, that there was little reason to believe that there would be internecine warfare in the aftermath of the war. Investigative reporting of any kind, failed to uncover these patterns of error, to uncover sufficiently these patterns of error, delusion, spin, manipulation, and call it what it was, lying at times, in real time, to any adequate degree. My friend A.J. Liebling, the late A.J. Liebling, once said again, "I take a grave view of the press. It is the weak slat under the bed of democracy." In this case, Liebling was right. It was weak. We were weak, just at the moment when we could least afford it. By contrast, the investigative reporting since the start of the Iraq War has been at times spectacular and brave. Because of that reporting, and believe me, not through any announcement of governments, we are informed about Abu Ghraib and torture at Guantanamo and elsewhere at Bagram Air Force Base. We know about the practice of renditions and the establishment of secret prisons. We know about unwarranted eavesdropping by the National Security Agency and the general tramping of constitutional norms, all in the name of a war that was intended, we were told, to do what? To establish constitutional norms abroad in Iraq. In nearly every case, the government reacted to these stories by charging the networks, the newspapers, and the magazines involved with a lack of patriotism, endangering the troops, and even in some cases, treason. The former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales hinted that the government may well react by invoking the Espionage Act of 1917 to provoke journalists. Thankfully, this hasn't been done. In a further attempt at secrecy and intimidation, the administration continues to brand more and more documents classified. According to the National Archives, there were 8 million documents and facts declared classified in 2001, 14 million in 2005. In recent years, individual reporters such as Seymour Hersh for The New Yorker, Jane Mayer, George Packer, all for The New Yorker, James Risen for The Times, Tom Ricks for The Post, and reporters abroad, and many, many more, have, through persistence, compiled a collective picture of the exercise of power these past years. The need for depth in investigative reporting is obvious and extends well, well, well beyond the boundaries of Iraq. You see it in your own country. You see it in Afghanistan. You see what's happening in terms of the assault on the press in Russia. We live in an increasingly endangered and difficult and complex world of economic crisis, of development with consequences in China and India, a world of nuclear proliferation, an increasingly speedy, fluid, dangerous, chaotic, and confusing world that is impossibly hard to understand for even the most informed and nimble minds at times. The need for press independence is obvious. Not just North Korea, not just China, Russia, and the Middle East. And what, dear brethren, in Italy are we to say of here? The situation is the same in Italy as it is in the United States. An independent press is absolutely necessary. Our own Michael Bloomberg, a very, very good mayor of the city of New York, is talking about running for president. On what basis? On the strength of a media fortune. All of us, as editors, as consumers, as internet moguls and press barons, need not only to recognize the necessity of this kind of aggressive reporting, but to support it, not just with sweet speeches at an evening like this. We have to support it not by shutting down foreign bureaus and calling it consolidation, supporting it not by demanding the sort of profit margins that even the most successful companies would consider outlandish. Not long ago, the Pakistani leader Pervez Musharraf asked President Bush about an article in The New Yorker written by Seymour Hersh. The president airily dismissed the report, saying, "Seymour Hersh is a liar." One of Donald Rumsfeld's spokesmen elegantly described Hersh's Abu Ghraib reporting as crap thrown against a wall, a tapestry of nonsense. This was his public statement. You can imagine the private one. Hersh's reporting has stood up over time, and in the face of an elected head of state whose calumny has turned out to be a kind of endorsement. If this really is a new age, an information age, an internet age, let's be sure that it is also an age of reporting of the deepest and most aggressive kind. Without it, the worst things can happen, and they often do. Thank you.